Diplomatic efforts at an impasse as Russia and Ukraine mull over a way forward after more than 3 years of fighting. Hello everyone, I'm Asiye Namdar in for Anna Naidu, and you're watching The Heat. Last year, Donald Trump vowed to end the conflict between Russia and Ukraine in, quote, 24 hours after retaking the White House. This week, he said conditions for a peace deal can only be negotiated between the two countries. The U.S. president made the comments after separate phone calls with Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. Now, Monday's highly anticipated conversations came just days after the delegations from Kyiv and Moscow met in Istanbul for the first time in more than 3 years. Those negotiations ended with a prisoner exchange agreement, but no ceasefire. To discuss this and much more, let's bring in our guest. Joining us here in the studio is Anton Fedyashin, professor of history at American University here in Washington. In Moscow, we have Andrey Kortunov. He's the former Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Andrey, let me begin with you and this phone call between Presidents Trump and Putin. President Trump initially said Russia and Ukraine would immediately begin ceasefire negotiations, but it seems he's backtracking a bit, even suggesting it's not his problem anymore, and the fact that he can perhaps walk away from these negotiations. Where do things stand, and what is your takeaway in all this?
Well, first of all, it was a long telephone call. They spoke for more than 2 hours, and they covered many issues, not only the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, but many dimensions of U.S.-Russian relations, including restoring the diplomatic dimension and maybe some economic cooperation projects as well. But speaking of specifically of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, I think President Putin tried to explain his logic to the U.S. president why the Kremlin is not ready to go for an unconditional ceasefire. And apparently this logic turned out to be rather compelling to the U.S. leader, because he decided not to subscribe, at least for the time being, not to subscribe to EU sanctions against Russia. So he is ready to give the Russian side the benefit of the doubt.
Interesting. Well, Anton, in your opinion, did that phone call really change anything? Did it move the needle in any way, shape, or form?
It's very difficult to predict Donald Trump's behavior because he intentionally keeps people guessing, be it economically, as Scott Bessent said in an interview about 2 weeks ago. Strategic uncertainty was the way that the United States was approaching its trade relations, and I see no reason for the same attitude not to be implemented in geopolitics. Trump is an entertainer as much as he is a businessman, and throwing rhetorical grenades into the public sphere, the global sphere, is what he does regularly. Tactically, he has been supporting Zelenskyy against Putin, and then Putin against Zelenskyy, and trying to extract what he considers to be a benefit for the United States. So just a few days ago after the phone call, it looks like he threw his weight behind the Russians. This may change again. Strategically, however, and this I think is what's most important, Trump understands that the Ukrainians have lost this war, that carrying on is going to become a problem for him politically. He has dwelt a lot during the campaign and afterwards about the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. He lambasted the Biden administration for how that loss was mishandled, and it looks like he doesn't want to repeat the same thing in Ukraine. And so the question is, how is he going to handle the pull away from Ukraine? And it looks like he's going to Ukrainianize the problem, just the way that the Americans Vietnamized the Vietnam War, pulled out, left a ceasefire that everyone expected to break down, and they were gone. And the rest is history. And I think that's the way things are going here.
Andrey, do you agree with Anton's assessment here? And how do the Russians see all of this and U.S. engagement, or maybe moving forward, lack of it?
Well, it's hard for me to make any conclusions about the U.S. policy sitting here in Moscow. But my wild guess is that Trump is not ready to hand Ukraine out to President Putin. Too much has been already invested into Ukraine by the United States, and definitely President Trump would like to get some returns on his investments. And that includes political returns. I think, in his view, Ukraine should remain an independent state, a pro-Western state, a pro-American state. And he also wants, I think he takes it seriously, he wants to have his resource deal with Ukraine, even if this deal turns out not to be as profitable as he probably has thought in the very first place. So I think that it will not be just a withdrawal from Ukraine. I think it will be a very gradual adjustment with attempts to somehow convince the Russian side that if this conflict is to continue, Russia will also suffer and will lose opportunities that otherwise it could explore together with the United States.
Let's take a listen to some comments from Vladimir Putin on Monday, and then I want to pose a question to both of you.
The question, of course, is for the Russian and Ukrainian sides to show maximum desire for peace and to find compromises that would suit all sides. At the same time, I should like to point out that Russia's position is clear overall. The main thing for us is to eliminate the root causes of this crisis.
To eliminate the root causes of this crisis. Anton, what is the root cause of this crisis?
Well, this is the least mysterious aspect of the story because the Russians have said this for hundreds of times over the past 10 years. NATO expansion, so fundamental Russian security concerns, the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine, those are the two overarching concerns. And then they have now added, since the special military operation began in 2022, they have added this question of the demilitarization of Ukraine and the denazification of Ukraine. In other words, the removal of right-wing nationalists from political power. Those are going to be, I think, the areas where the compromises can be reached. Questions of levels, access, that kind of thing. On the question of NATO expansion into Ukraine and on the question of the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine, in sovereign Ukraine, those are the things where, those are the issues where the Russians are least likely to compromise, but at the expense of the other two issues. And we'll have to see how this goes. But we won't be clear about this until the Ukrainians and the Russians start negotiating on a regular basis, not the kind of PR TikTok meeting that Zelenskyy wants between him and Putin that's going to settle anything. Diplomacy doesn't work that way. It's going to have to be weeks and then months of negotiations, and then we'll see where we get.
Andrey, do you think that's what's needed here, direct negotiations between these two men to make some kind of headway after 3 years?
Well, I think that direct negotiations between Moscow and Kyiv are indispensable. But I also think that if we are thinking about any final resolution of this crisis, then other participants should also be engaged, including major European powers, because it is not just between Moscow and Kyiv, it is between Russia and NATO, it is between Russia and the West. So additional players have to be brought to the table. But I fully agree that it will be a long and very difficult process, even if we assume that the political will be there, because there are so many specific issues, so many ambiguities. Even the Russian list of demands looks so general. And of course, on the Ukrainian side, there is also a question whether Ukraine can deliver, because even if Zelenskyy agrees to a compromise, we cannot take it for granted that those rightist radical forces which call the tunes to a large extent in Kyiv are ready to commit a political suicide and to just get out of the political scene. I'm afraid that it would be very difficult to make sure that any agreement that might be reached will be honored by those in Kyiv who are not happy about this agreement.
Vladimir Putin has welcomed a potential peace memorandum, if you will. And what does that even mean? What is a peace memorandum? And why not say, yes, there will be a ceasefire if the Ukrainians can agree to A, B, C, and D? Why not say that? Andrey, let me turn to you, and then I want Anton to answer that.
Well, I think that the idea of a memorandum is that it should reflect some bilateral agreement, at least on certain issues where such an agreement can be reached. Of course, Russia has its own list of demands, and it can present it to Ukraine today or tomorrow. But the trick is to agree to some points which would make a ceasefire and later on a peace agreement possible.
So when are we going to see this so-called peace memorandum, Anton?
Well, I think it's going to take several weeks to work this out. By the way, according to Moscow, work on this document is actually proceeding on both sides. Now, how this is going to go, no one can predict. So things are slowly moving ahead. But here, the question becomes one of sequencing. The Ukrainians want a ceasefire first, and then negotiations while they rearm and probably
well,
with
the Russians could be rearming
idea,
too.
well, they never stopped fighting. So for the Russians, the sequencing is in reverse. They want the negotiations first that address the fundamental causes of the conflict and then the ceasefire. So all of this has to be worked out at the negotiating table. And the one thing that we can say for the Trump administration is that it finally pushed the Ukrainians to actually meet the Russians at the negotiating table, because if we look for about a year or two backwards, the official Ukrainian policy was absolutely no negotiations with the Russians until we regain our borders of the pre-2014. And everyone now realizes that is unrealistic. So we're moving towards negotiations, but that may take a while.
Well, you bring me to my next point, which is the whole importance and how critical negotiations are. And it appears that the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio also believes that. He addressed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee this week, and this is what he had to say.
On the issue of Ukraine, here's what we can all agree on. There is no military solution to this crisis.
Right.
It will have to end in a negotiated settlement. And the fundamental challenge we have in Ukraine is this. Russia wants what they do not currently have and are not entitled to, and Ukraine wants what they cannot regain militarily. And that's been the crux of the challenge.
Anton, do you agree with what Rubio had to say?
Absolutely. Marco Rubio has flashes of basic realpolitik, balance of power politics and sobriety occasionally, and this was one of them. He's absolutely right, and this is why these sort of contradictory goals have to be worked out at the negotiating table.
Andrey, what did you make of what Secretary of State Marco Rubio had to say?
Well, I think that it reflects the current very fragile balance of power on the battlefield. Indeed, Russia cannot right now claim what it believes it has to acquire, and Ukraine cannot protect what it believes to be Ukrainian. So we have a very delicate situation, and the basic question is what is the momentum? What side is gaining and what side is losing? Of course, on the Russian side, there is a perception that Russia is gaining and Ukraine is losing. Ukrainians apparently believe that with additional support from Europe, they can at least stabilize the line of contact, but it is yet to be seen.
So, Andrey, what would you tell Donald Trump's critics, plenty of them here in the United States and also around the world? They say Vladimir Putin is really not interested in peace, that this is all a delaying tactic while he's continuing his military campaign and carving out new territory. They say Putin is using Trump to get what he wants and create an illusion that he's interested in some kind of settlement. What would you tell those critics?
Well, I would say that whether we like Donald Trump or not, but he is the only leader who was able to bring Russians and Ukrainians to sit in Istanbul and to start this process. I think we should definitely hope that his efforts will allow this process to go further. And of course, he will exercise pressure on both sides. But I think it would be wrong to argue that he is playing for Putin. He wants to protect the U.S. interests the way he sees these interests. And I think this is what any U.S. president should do.
Andrey Kortunov and Anton Fedyashin, thank you for being on the program. More of our conversation on the Russia-Ukraine conflict coming up. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. We continue our conversation about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Joining us from Dallas, Sergiy Kudelia is an associate professor of political science at Baylor University. Professor, we've been talking a lot about this phone call that happened Monday between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. Then Donald Trump had two separate phone calls with President Zelenskyy. What do you make of all this back and forth? Where is it all headed? And at this point, what's the best case scenario for Ukraine and what it wants?
Well, the best case scenario for Ukraine is for the United States to remain involved in negotiations, because based on the statement that Donald Trump made on the social media after the phone calls, one can conclude that the United States wants to withdraw from mediation of negotiations. He argued that all the details have to be figured out between Russia and Ukraine directly. And this is not something that Ukraine would want, because we understand that the Russians' tactic in these negotiations is to follow or adopt maximalist demands on Ukraine, demand things that they know for sure Ukraine will never be able to implement, and hence blame Ukraine afterwards for any failure to negotiate or to agree. And in these conditions, only the United States and Europeans can exercise sufficient pressure over Russia to reconsider some of its demands and offer a more acceptable compromise solutions that Ukrainians can embrace regarding the ceasefire conditions. Yeah. This is really the key question for the future.
President Trump seemed rather upbeat and optimistic in the beginning. If you remember, last year, he said that once he's reelected, he can solve this conflict within 24 hours. Clearly, it has proved a lot more challenging. And now he seems to be suggesting that this is really up to Ukraine and Russia to resolve. But despite that, do the Ukrainians still want this kind of engagement from the United States? Apparently, it was a question that was posed to President Zelenskyy, and this is what he had to say. Let's take a listen.
It is important that America continues to be a part of the process of bringing peace closer. It is America that Russia is afraid of, and it is American influence that can save many lives if it influences Putin to end a war.
Sergiy, how much influence does President Trump really have over President Putin, especially now where he seems to be sort of backtracking?
Well, President Trump and the United States in general are a crucial partner for Ukraine, as we know, for the last 3 years of the war. And it's a crucial ally for the Europeans, because without the United States, the sanctions, the new sanctions that are being adopted by the Europeans, they would have less of an effect on Russia. So the effectiveness of sanctions depends on unified effort of the United States and Europeans. And in this sense, Donald Trump has significant leverage over Putin. Putin has been publicly emphasizing how much Trump respects Russia now, how much Russia can benefit from the future economic relations with the United States. And so this is, if Donald Trump makes specific demands on Russia, that Russia would have to make concessions to Ukraine.
But do you think he's doing that, Professor? Is Donald Trump doing that?
From what we've seen so far, Donald Trump is not willing to use this leverage. And in fact, what he is trying to do is to find justifications for why this leverage should not be used in the future and find excuses for the Russians. And that is, I think, a great concern for the Ukrainians. And that is why President Zelenskyy has been emphasizing the significance of America for Ukraine.
So that's what's confusing for a lot of people. From one side, the Ukrainians are a little worried about the fact that President Trump is not putting pressure on Vladimir Putin. But from another side, they say, no, 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 we do want the Americans involved.
Well, there's nothing contradictory between these two statements. And I think the main question is, what are the goals of Donald Trump? If Donald Trump's goals are to make sure that negotiations reach a certain settlement between Russia and Ukraine, many of the analysts, and I agree with them, argue that without sufficient pressure on Russia, that goal will not be achieved. If Donald Trump's goal is to avoid any pressure on Russia, maybe to lift sanctions on Russia, and find justifications for normalization of relations between the United States and Russia, then certainly negotiations are not going to be successful. And Ukraine will ultimately be left for the Europeans to defend and to support.
So what would a final settlement, Professor, look like between these two countries?
Well, the key first step, of course, is agreement on the ceasefire. And Ukrainians have already changed their position on that. So remember, earlier this year, Zelenskyy said that we cannot agree to a ceasefire without security guarantees. Now the position of official Kiev is that we can accept ceasefire without any conditions, without any specific preconditions. And so ultimately, it's the Russians who are setting up these additional reasons for why ceasefire cannot be achieved. And it's really on the Russia's responsibility to come to an agreement on the ceasefire. This is the first step. Then we can talk about other political aspects, legal aspects of the settlement. But this is something that will be negotiated over a longer period of time. The key now is to stop active large-scale fighting and combat operations.
And we're running out of time, but a final question and a yes or no answer, if possible, Professor. Do you believe this administration can bring peace between Ukraine and Russia?
I do not believe that Trump administration can ultimately bring peace between Russia and Ukraine, because so far we have not seen that the Trump administration is willing to use the leverage against Putin. If that changes, then they have a better shot at peace.
All right, we'll leave it there. Professor Sergiy Kudelia, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Joining us for the European perspective is Klaus Larres. He's a professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Professor, I'd like to begin with that phone call on Monday between President Trump and Ukraine's President Zelenskyy. Two phone calls, in fact. One also involved 5 other European leaders who joined the call after President Trump spoke to Vladimir Putin. Would it be accurate to say that a lot of Europeans had hoped during that phone call that Putin would agree to a ceasefire, but that didn't happen?
Yes, that is very correct. You know, there was quite a bit of hope which was connected with a phone call between Trump and Putin. And at least it was expected that Trump would put some sort of pressure on Putin if he didn't agree to a ceasefire and was evasive again and so on. And he did not do anything like that. And the Europeans were actually quite shocked when they learned about the very good atmosphere in the talks between Trump and Putin, and that Trump really had not put any pressure on Putin. He had not threatened with sanctions. He had not asked for a ceasefire in any sensible way. And therefore, he had just a good chat with Putin. That is what the European leaders believed, what Zelenskyy believed, and they were pretty disappointed.
So how do the Europeans see these negotiations that Donald Trump seemed to be so optimistic and hopeful about, and now he seems to be backtracking a bit and washing his hands, saying it's up to Russia and Ukraine to figure this out?
Yes, Donald Trump seems to be all talk, and he likes to have quick successes. If he can't get a success within a few weeks, then he loses hope, he loses interest in the issue, and seems to become frustrated and just pull out. And that is what he's indicating, that that is really a European war that has nothing to do with the United States, and that the Europeans and Ukraine and Putin should really sort it out among themselves. That is, of course, not what has happened during the last 2 to 3 years of the war, where the United States were very, very heavily involved in providing weapons to Ukraine and intelligence information, where the United States was one of the strongest backers of Ukraine. But Donald Trump has reversed that position and seems to be really to be strung along by Putin. And he believes what Putin tells him, that Putin keeps saying he wants a peace settlement, but right now he's not quite capable to get there. And Trump simply believes it. He never really doubts what Putin tells him.
And without waiting for Washington, the European Union and Britain announced another round of sanctions against Russia. Professor, are these sanctions effective? Do they do anything? We've seen one round of sanctions after another, and the conflict continues.
That is very true. The conflict, unfortunately, continues. But these sanctions have been effective, perhaps not as effective as one would like, but they have done damage to the Russian war economy. And Russia finds it very difficult to export oil and gas in via normal channels. It is reliant on a 500 fleet strong gray shadow fleet and to get its oil to the consumer. And to be fair to the United States, there's also pressure in Congress for new sanctions on Russia. That is spearheaded by Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, and he's trying to get through Congress a secondary sanctions packet, which would put 500% import duties on those countries which still continue to accept gas and oil from Russia. That would be very, very effective if it went through, but so far we don't know whether Congress will pass it, and also we don't know how Trump would react to it.
So where do we go from this point, Professor? How likely is a potential face-to-face meeting between the presidents of Ukraine and Russia, and will that possibly make a difference?
Well, that is what Trump originally believed, but I don't think there's any prospect of a meeting between Putin and Trump, because what should it achieve? You know, it couldn't achieve possibly more than what was not achieved during the phone call. So I think Putin has no intention to, at the moment, stop the war or even agree to a ceasefire. It seems that he wants to conquer all of the 4 provinces he officially annexed in 2022, Ukrainian provinces, and he is almost there. He hasn't quite conquered all of them, but I think he wants to complete the conquest of these provinces. Then he wants to certainly push out Ukraine from the Kursk region. Kursk still seems to have under control something like 30 square miles. That is not much, but still Russian territory is still occupied by Ukraine to some extent. And then he still insists on the neutrality of Ukraine, and he also seems to be pushing for new elections in Ukraine. He wants to get rid of Zelenskyy. He wants to have a Russian puppet installed in Kiev.
And that's our program for now. I'm Asiye Namdar in Washington. Thanks for watching another edition of The Heat.